basically, I think I've said I'll talk about 21st century children, language literacy and learning across the curriculum, which is a really snappy title. But it sums up the two major interests that I've had in primary education and now very much early years education over the last 15 years. This story is getting a bit old now, but it actually is a very important one to me. Back in 1998, when I was working for, I feel really guilty admitting this, the English National Literacy Strategy. Did anyone have personal experience of that? Because if you did, you may hiss. I'm not offended at all. But I was going around England particularly, but also got luckily over to Wales quite often, talking to teachers. And it was one significant day in Yorkshire when I was there to do writing. It was writing at year 6. And this lovely Yorkshire teacher came over and sort of tried to put me right during the lunch break, because they do in Yorkshire, they like to tell you things. And she said, "Look, love, you've got it all wrong way round, you folk at Strategy. They can't write until they can talk. And they can't talk until they can listen. And they can't bloody listen." She changed my life because it summed up absolutely beautifully what I was hearing everywhere I went, that teachers in the mid to late 90s were noticing significant changes in children. The sorts of things that I was hearing were constantly, sort of difficulties in focusing attention, problems with self-regulation, and another big one that cropped up was not getting along as well in the playground. When I first heard it, as you do, I immediately thought, this is just normal. Everybody has always said throughout history that the younger generation is going to the dogs, and therefore I shall not take any notice of it. But honestly, I'd been on the road by this time for 4 or 5 years, and it was thousands of people saying it. And it wasn't just teachers that had been in the profession a long time, it was also young teachers. And I think probably the most depressing phrase I got, I used to write down the phrases I heard often in my notebooks and then tally. And the one that got the most the most that they said was said most often. And it was mostly in disadvantaged areas. And the line was, "Language is going down year on year." And it was that sort of made me want to go off and research child development. But at the same time, the Yorkshire teacher was affecting my work in literacy. So she said, on one hand, I started going off and ended up doing that book, which came out in 2006. Big year 2006 was for me. On the other hand, I thought, she's right. How are we going to get children writing unless, first of all, we get them talking and listening? So that ended up with me developing, and again, it was around about 2005-06 that I finally got to this. It takes a long time to get to sort of work out simple models. The simpler the model, the more general the model, the more difficult it is to work out. Any luck? Big moment again. Oh, that's lovely, thank you. Can you hear me? Oh, thank goodness. I didn't think I could keep that shouting up. Thank you very much. Oh, he's gone. Thank you very much. but basically, I finally got it down to what I called my two horses model. And the reason was she'd finished off her little homily with, you're trying to put the cart before the horse, you know. So what I wanted to try and work out was how did you make sure that right across the curriculum you put the speaking and listening horses in front of the writing cart? And it ended up, finally, like I tried so many different ones. In the end, it ended up like this. And I'd split it into two teams of horses. The top team of horses is about content. That's about learning. It's about whatever subject area you're doing, whatever it is, geography, history, science, cross-curricular, making sure that children have internalized, learnt the stuff you want them to get, but also talked a lot within the context of the learning. So it's a principle of active learning, plenty of opportunities for conversation, plenty of opportunities for them to develop an understanding of the vocabulary. Not just trotting it out, but actually having a deeper conceptual understanding. And the second bit there, the organised bit, is the bit that I think I'm probably best known for, because that landed up being, no, not that one, these things that people very often have in schools, the skeleton books. And I'll come back to them later. But the idea was that before we get children to write, we really need them to work out the concepts, the ideas, and think about it beforehand, how they're going to write it. It's not too difficult if you're writing chronological text, because you start at the beginning and you go trip, trap along. But if they're trying to write report text or explanation text or persuasion, they really need to have a period of thinking, what is it I'm trying to do? And what I wanted was a way you could do that, which also gave opportunities for speaking and listening. So we're looking at the top team as being content. Bottom team is the actual writing. The actual turning the thoughts that they've got, the ideas they've got, into coherent sentences. And this was very much influenced by the idea of talk for writing, which developed through the literacy strategy. So first of all, does Pi Corbett often come round these parts? Right, Pi and I worked together very closely for about 4 years at the beginning of the 2000s. And the term talk for writing and grammar for writing were two that we were particularly involved in. So he had a lovely line, they need to read a lot because that's where they'll get the patterns of written language, and we want them to read like a writer, so that they're picking up those patterns and creating their toolkits for writing that sort of fit different sorts of texts. So that's what that first bit relates to. And the second bit was the one that we both became very, very much involved in for the last decade, which has been actually getting children to talk in sentences and to use the sorts of sentences that you use in writing before we ask them to write them down on paper. So that became the teaching model that appeared, and I wanted to get that out of the way, because if I'd started trying to explain that to you towards the end of the day, you'd all be sleeping. Oh, and the final thing about it was that both of us finally agreed the only way to deal with things like spelling and grammar is to teach them separately in a particular little English lesson, or English globbits of, short, fast bursts here and there that were the opportunities just to make sure they got the patterns of the spelling or the particular grammatical concepts. And then you could pull those in as part of your collection of your toolkit or your talk for writing. Sadly, all that went rather bitterly wrong. The English national curriculum at the moment has just been revised. I suppose you've probably heard all about that. I think that I can't remember the exact exact proportions, but it's something like 20 pages on spelling and grammar, 1 page on talk, and half a page on drama in the English curriculum. But there's another issue that I don't know how they're going to address, which is they're changing assessment techniques. I mean, I realise things are very different in Wales, but I also realise that what happens in England is unfortunately increasingly affecting what happens in Wales. So you need to be aware of what's going on in terms of this assessment. The only trouble is we don't know yet. But we've had these 5 levels of attainment. Yeah? Do they correlate to? And the big thing was to get to a level 5 by the end of primary, if you could manage that. The assessment has been completely changed, but nobody knows what it is yet. The only thing we've been told is the levels have gone. And that is the alarm and despondency around the land, because everybody got really good at the dark art of levelling. And what had actually happened, and the reason I think that the curriculum people, certainly the reason that the linguists I was involved in with were very much opposed to what was happening with levelling, was that it had turned into a sort of tick list exercise. Writing had become a tick list exercise. You wanted to get a level 5, you had to make sure you'd got this sorts of connectives and these sorts of grammatical constructions and this sort of this. And the children were not actually writing for meaning at all. They were writing to make sure they'd got all these bits in. So that's why they've said we're not going to be doing it according to the level system, but nobody yet knows what they're going to bring in. Can I just prophesy now? Whatever it is they bring in, it will be perverted. One of the glorious things about the standardized testing system is that as soon as it is brought in and the standardized test is devised, everybody teaches to the test. Well, I remember reading about Dylan Thomas once. He once went up on a hill and he met an old shepherd who used to make ritual observances to the moon. And when Dylan Thomas asked him why he did this, the old shepherd said, "I'd be a damn fool if I didn't." And that is why people teach to the test, because they'd be a damn fool if they didn't, if that's what they're being assessed. Oh dear. So I have to say, once I'd realised that this was what was happening with the literacy strategy, which was around about 2002, I removed myself from it. And I've spent the last 10 years trying to find ways of doing what they want us to do while doing as little damage as possible, which seems to me the only way we can go about it. But for me, that was why it was so important to look at the children as well. And as well as I say, my work in literacy, that Yorkshire teacher was the final spark who said to me, go and find out if there is anything going on. And I ended up on it was an 8-year quest with a book published in 2006, just looking at contemporary childhood, where the kids are coming from, and what might be the possible reasons why they were finding it more difficult to focus attention, more difficult to self-regulate. We were getting an enormous number more special educational needs. You see, one of the great advantages of age is that you can look back and see when things happened. And as a young teacher in 1970, but I was actually a young teacher in 1970, we had children, we didn't call it special needs, but we obviously had some children who found it more difficult to, learn than others. But it was nothing like the proportions that you're seeing now. Nothing. Dyslexia wasn't invented really until sometime in the 1970s. Then we got a real rash of that. ADHD was invented in 1980. Then it swelled to enormous proportions. More than 500,000 prescriptions for Ritalin written every year at the moment. I was already in special needs by the late 90s, and I hadn't heard the words autistic spectrum or even Asperger's until 1995. We'd heard of really severe autism, but the high-level, high-functioning autism was just not on the radar. And when I researched for toxic childhood, I found that in 1980, the number of children diagnosed with autism in America was 1 in 100,000. Yep. Last year, it was 1 in 100. Now, that's a pretty significant shift. And I know that all these things, the reasons that we're getting more diagnoses is we're getting better at recognizing specific problems, specific learning difficulties and developmental disorders. And certainly I would say that any developmental disorder that a child has, there is almost certainly a genetic predisposition to it. There's going to be something about that child's mental wiring or possibly physical. My own daughter had really severe dyslexia, which was clearly related to intermittent hearing loss. So she just didn't pick up the phonemes. But I am convinced, as a result of the work I've been doing, that if there is a predisposition, nowadays the sorts of cultural influences on children, endless little things coming together, are going to make it worse. That was my thesis when I started the book. And it was partly because it wasn't just, by the time I got to the book, it wasn't just the UK that I was hearing this. It was also in America, Japan, and to a lesser extent on the continent, and Australia. So those basic things that they were noticing, the teachers, are the sorts of things which are involved in the developmental disorders. That's the way, you maybe talk about it at the bus stop. What occurred to me is, if you think about it, all babies are like that. That's how they're born. But we expect over time them to develop those capacities. And what my interest was, could there be things in our culture which are making it more difficult to develop them? And boy, oh boy, did I find them. I ended up, and this is why it took 8 years, looking at 10 areas of childhood. I was decided on the areas as a result of what teachers were telling me. Most of the research came from what I heard in the field, because those teachers, incidentally, turned out to be completely right. Language had been going down year on year in the disadvantaged areas. A researcher called Sally Ward had recorded that. Starting with listening, the Yorkshire teacher was right. Children of 9 months, their listening skills, capacity to focus, to single out a foreground sound against background noise by the age of 9 months, which is essential for discriminating phonemes and therefore has knock-on effects on all language development. She found a really serious deterioration between 1984 and 1999. In 1984, 20% of the children she tested could not do it. By 1999, it was 40%. Hugely significant. On the basis of that, the speech and language people started to get very, very exercised, and I was involved with both National Literacy Trust Talk to Your Baby and Basic Skills Agency. They did some lovely work in Wales on trying to get parents talking more to children. But it didn't actually hit government level until 2006, when ICANN, the speech and language charity, collated results on children's language on arrival at school and found that in the disadvantaged areas, 50% and upwards were arriving with significant language delay. Stoke-on-Trent won that year, you know, with 84%. I mean, it was terrifying. Those teachers, that's why I was interested. Those teachers are in the field. You're in the field all the time. You know what's going on. And you're seeing cohorts of children come through. People in government offices haven't got the first idea. So basically they said, well, we think it might be to do with this. But actually, I finally concluded that Sally Ward was that speech and language therapist who did the listening research. She was my first ever interviewee. And when I said, what do you think's the cause behind it? She said, I don't think it's one thing. I think it's lots and lots of things coming together. And I think she was completely right. And I think because we've all got such totally individual, neural wiring, totally individual experience, some children are going to be affected by certain things, some aren't. But all the ill effects I was finding from processed food, due to lack of activity, due to poor sleeping habits, all of these would have the same sorts of effect on prefrontal cortex functions. And so would lack of communication, the sort of social things, those are the physical ones, social things like communication and being with family, family breakdown, inadequate attachment bonds at an early age, problems with childcare, highly pressurized education system. They too, it's emotional disturbance. If you've got an emotional disturbance or lack of confidence, you all know yourself when you're emotionally disturbed, you can't concentrate. You know, if I'm upset about something, I can give up trying to write for that day. Best thing is probably to do the washing up and clean the house. And then we've got the final 3 chapters, which was looking at what could it be, the major influences behind these changes. Because quite frankly, it's very obvious that with each one of them that even if as a parent you're doing your very, very best to give children a lovely, healthy, natural diet, there is going to be in the corner of the room somebody else who's making another suggestion. So what I finally concluded was we'd got 2 things coming together. One was the absolutely perverse power of marketing, and when I looked into that, and honestly, the people I ended up interviewing, I ended up interviewing world-famous economists and people who were experts on marketing, and the marketing ones had only really just started questioning what was going on. First books on this subject came out in 2005 because nobody had noticed what they were doing, the way they were impacting on children and going in right under the parental radar by taking over play, infecting the way children related to each other, and infiltrating playground culture. My favourite story on that one has been a little girl. It was a head teacher that told me in Essex, fairly infected place, Essex, with this sort of stuff. And he said his little girl, who was 3, she'd never seen the telly. Well, not much. They didn't have one. And she loved playing out in the garden, messing about, Then she started playgroup. And the first day she got back from, not playgroup, nursery school. First day she got back from nursery school, she was singing a little ditty they'd never heard. It went, Lelly Kelly are the cutest shoes, oh yeah. Right. And they thought, They went to buy shoes some months later, and they couldn't believe it. This child made a beeline for the Lelly Kelly shoes. And when Dad said and Mum said, no, they're not the sort we need, she, for the first time ever, threw a total raging hissy fit in the shop, was lying on the floor, banging her little feet and screaming, I need them! Had to be picked up bodily and taken home, apparently. where they explained why and so on, and then she was fine. But Dad said it was dreadful because if we hadn't, we're both teachers, if we hadn't known about kids, we wouldn't have had the sort of strength of mind to, we would have got keeled over. I said, why didn't you like the shoes? He said, well, first of all, they cost an arm and a leg. Secondly, they were completely inappropriate because she likes to play out and get grubby, and you know, she would be sort of standing like this in these because they are exactly the most beautiful, for a little girl of 3, they are the most beautiful things you've ever seen. They're somewhere between a toy and a shoe, you know, and all covered in rainbows and flowers and glitter. And so he said they weren't appropriate. And thirdly, he said, and anyway, I didn't want to buy something that came with a little bag containing makeup. When we're giving makeup to 3-year-olds, what's going on? But a lot of this has been going on under the radar of parents, and then it becomes part of playground culture, and then you think, well, if my little girl or boy hasn't got it, they're going to be the only one. And kids are really good at playing that one. Really good. Can I just assure you that I when I'm traveling around, I do loads of talks to parents, and the ones who have held out and said, no, you are not having a telly in your bedroom. No, you are not having vastly inappropriate clothing. No, you are not going to be playing on the computer game all night. No, you are not going to be. The ones who've actually, you know, decided that they will hold fast, and I've been meeting lots of them, they all say, they do still love us, you know. We can get away with it. And it's not done them any harm. And as long as, there was one lovely nutritionist, when I'm not allowed to give her name, she said, this is me talking as a mum. As a professional, I'm supposed to say 0 option, but as a mum, I do 80-20, she said. I always reckon if they get 80% good nourishing food, 20% is not going to do them any harm, and they'll know enough about it and be streetwise enough to be like the other kids, which struck me as very sensible. But basically, children like knowing that you love them, and as long as you're explaining why you're doing this, then they're usually okay. There's one mum said, she said he all the way through his childhood and his adolescence, he used to say, well, I'm the only one that's not got any this, and I'm the only one that doesn't do this. She said he's just gone to Oxford, and he came back during the first vacation and said, you know, Mum, it's really weird. All the other lads there were the only one as well. So I think that the whole business of the marketing and the extent to which they've been getting kids to do things against parental wishes and then getting peer pressure operating on parents has been a hugely detrimental thing. But of course it also came at the same time as Moore's Law went viral, went wild. Mr. Moore was one of the founders of Intel, and in the late 60s, he said the power and potential of digital technology will double roughly every 2 years. And he was basing that on the fact that the chips would shrink in size gradually over time. And he has been absolutely right. In fact, they're now saying it's doubling every 18 months. We're on an axis. So if you think about it, that means that each doubling's getting a little bit more. And this is a really beautiful illustration of it, because this is the screen that my designer made for me in 2006. That was state-of-the-art technology. We didn't even have a word for smartphones. Yeah, they were just becoming smart. There's so many things missing off. I mean, when did you last see a camcorder? For goodness sake, nobody needs a camcorder anymore, do they? Unless you're an official sort of filmmaker. The things that are missing are things like Wi-Fi. Now, it's not that Wi-Fi wasn't around in 2006, it just wasn't normal for people, and I didn't really know about it much. I didn't get my dongle, I don't think, for another couple of years. No, we don't need a dongle anymore. Sat-nav's not on, without which we would not be here today, I can tell you, because I'm completely reliant on it now. The one that really I personally recognised specifically was 2006, same year my book was published, Facebook and Twitter became available to the general public. That was the first time. That's now one of the, they're like global economies, both of them, aren't they? Anyone like to guess when the iPad came on the market? It was Christmas 2010. So it has been with us for 3.5 years or so, and the acceleration with which that has absolutely affected daily life has been phenomenal. So my theory was there were these twin movements, this huge push of consumerism, plus this incredible speed. So that, you know, you're a parent and you're thinking, well, is it good for him to have an Xbox? I don't know, but everybody else seems to have an Xbox. Oh, gosh, now there's a new one. There's a, what's it called, a Wii? Oh, everybody's got one. We better have one. You know, it's that sort of terrible speed that you've not got time to... And the other thing is, there's no time for there to be any research into whether any of these things are actually doing children any good. Because we might have a world that's going at the most incredible speed. Oh yeah, I don't need that there, I can go straight on. But basically, our brains are the same brains that we've always had since Stone Age times, since we became Homo sapiens sapiens. And we became Homo sapiens sapiens when we clocked language. Right? So we still need the same things in order to develop those language and learning skills that have got us this far, that we've always needed. And one of the things about technology is it offers shortcuts. That's what's so great about it for a grown-up. The shortcut with this stuff for me, compared with the olden days with putting overheads on and having to faff about getting them, and you know, it's wonderful. And I really, really, really don't want to knock it. But the great question is whether shortcuts are good, particularly at the earliest stages of human development. There was a fascinating program on this morning, Andrew Marr's program at 9 o'clock on the radio, which was about neuroscience. And you know, it's becoming quite clear that there are effects of modern technology on all our minds. There was a book came out about 3 years ago called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, which was basically saying that we do find it harder to focus our attention. It is getting an awful lot harder to read a long book, you know, because there's just so much going on all the time to distract us from it. And it's just, gosh, my phone just pinged. Oh, you know, you've got to keep checking things up. Now, that doesn't matter as long as you've got a fully formed human adult brain, as long as you've learned and practiced repeatedly the various sorts of things that help you focus your attention, regulate your behavior, and empathize with other people. As long as you've had in childhood opportunities to lay down those neural networks, world can change, our brains change to adapt to it, but we can still, when we need to, readjust and go back. And I am now making a principle of reading one darned great big thick book a year. I'm hoping it will stave off the Alzheimer's. But unfortunately, my copy of Les Miserables is somewhere in Leeds. I lost it, and I'm really furious. I'm just on to book 2. But we need to make sure that we still can do those things, but we can recoup them. The basic neural networks are in there. What I was concerned about was that if we didn't make sure children developed those neural networks, could we make sure they developed language? Could we make sure that their capacity to learn, their motivation to learn is still there? And how is literacy going to fare as a result of all this? So then I started being interested in the developmental psychology behind those first 7 years. And at this time, I was so in awe of Wales, because here was the only UK country that was looking at a foundation stage to 7 based on developmental principles. And I used to delight in coming back to Wales and saying, oh, you are wonderful. And I learnt to venerate the name Jane Davidson. And it was wonderful that there was one country doing it. It was terrible a couple of years back when I first came back and found that, oh my goodness me, you've now got not only a test at 7, but it's a test at 7 that's even more difficult in terms of the literacy content than the one we're giving them in England. So now my hope is in Scotland, I fear. And I'm up there now with my daughter wanted to come as well. So my granddaughter is being brought up a Scot, and we're sending her to the Gaelic speaking school so she gets bilingual. But they're I think the hope at the moment of being able to try and keep education away from what a chap called Pasi Sahlberg calls the global education reform movement. Global education reform movement. Basically, he's a Finnish educationist and politician. I'm not quite sure. He's something big in the Ministry of Education, anyway. And he's interested in taking the road less travelled at the moment than the one which is. He reckons the global education reform movement started in America towards the end of the 90s, with the George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind policy, which involved an enormous amount of standardized testing and then teaching to those standardized tests. In UK, we were doing the same thing, and I think that we fed the Americans as much as the Americans fed, England fed the Americans as much as the Americans fed England. Basically, GERM is about standardized testing, targets, and a very, very early start to formal education. And it is increasingly affecting countries around the developed world, even ones that have not had that particular ethos in the past. I was in Paris because I wanted to go and look at the École Maternelle. There is absolute fury among French early years people at the moment, because that principle of you've got to get children reading and writing at a very early age has been pushed down into the École Maternelle, which was not the way they were supposed to work. That's the ones that go up to 6. So that's happening all over the world at the moment. The place that is holding out against it is the Scandinavian countries, with Finland particularly in the lead. And it's rather interestingly that Finland tends to get the very best literacy results in Europe and some of the best maths results, very high in the League of Childhood Wellbeing in the developed world, the one in which the UNICEF survey in which the UK sadly came bottom. It has a very good GDP, it's a rich country, but it also has the smallest gap between rich and poor in Europe, another thing in which the UK comes bottom. And it also has the lowest level of marital breakdown in Europe, interestingly, another something in which the UK comes bottom, and it has the lowest prison population, one in which the UK comes top. And when I interviewed Pasi Sahlberg around about 2005, he said he thought that this has taken a long time to achieve, but he said that their principle was that we spend a great deal of time looking at what is best for our youngest children, 0 to 7. So that's why I thought, what do they need, 0 to 7? And that's what I've been finding out, the ones that flourish. So I'll go to something different now. I ended up, in fact, working with an absolutely fantastic early years person. I don't know if she did come to Wales. Her name's Ros Bailey. She was a very tall woman with a absolute mass of orange hair. Totally wonderful person, and sadly died in 2012. Dreadfully, dreadfully missed. And we'd done a book together called that, Foundations of Literacy, which we, as Ros became ill, we'd just been asked to do a 4th edition, which links it to the most recent version of the early years foundation stage in England. Really interesting. We've had to do, since we first wrote it, which I think was around about 2003, we've had to do 4 different editions as they change the wretched thing over and over again. But anyway, fortunately, Ros's great friend Lynn Broadbent helped me do it, and that's in its beautifully redone actually by the company. And what we were looking at is, what do they need? Well, first of all, some of it can't be done in school. Some of it is in that period 0 to 3. And it's just to do with being allowed to be a child. The first thing they need, the most important thing they need in that period is love. Constant, consistent, one-on-one, loving attention. Certainly up to 2. The jury's out between 2 and 3. Girls particularly seem to prosper between 2 and 3 if they're in a more institutional setting. Certainly by 3, it seems necessary for them to be with other children as much as possible. And since we have small families now, nursery education is vital from that period. They need to be mixing with other kids. One of the evolutionary psychologists that I read, I didn't get to speak to this one, Judith Rich Harris, she reckons that basically by around about 2.5, mum is going to have had another baby. So mum is going to be busy with the new one, and children would be given to the other children to be looked after. So you'd be looked after by older siblings from around about then. But you would still be well out of the sphere of sort of adult intervention. So up to that period, really the most important thing is going to be interaction with loving adults. Right from the beginning, that constant interaction that comes when a baby is being cared for and looked after. It's got a lovely name in the developmental literature, that. It's called the dance of communication. And it is actually a dance with a baby, isn't it? Because anybody that's done it knows that you are hopping from foot to foot in a rhythmic way. But it's also a song, because what's waking up their brain, what's helping them to focus their attention, is rhythm, music. It's deep, deep inside us. I've got this conviction, actually, that there is a broad resemblance between the evolution of the human brain to this Homo sapiens sapiens and the stages that the children go through in 0 to 7. The first one being that mum is singing away. They hear those phonemes, they hear those rhythms. They gradually start wanting to imitate them themselves. Can I just say, though, it's not just talking. If you want those children also to empathize and to be what's called mind-minded, and understanding that other people have brains, that they've got a mind and other people have minds too, if you want that, there's a lot more than just talking. It's that constant physical, personal, in real-time interaction of, when I look at you, something just happened with your eyes, and then your face changed slightly, and then you smiled, and then you nodded. It's body language, it's facial expression, it's eye contact, there's tons of things going on in terms of human communication. that gradually over the first 18 months or so of children's lives help them gather that this nice person who's the main person who looks after me and that I really now know really well now because we've been looking at each other an awful lot and she's really kind and she sings to me and she talks to me and she tells me that's a doggy over there, that this person, right, has got a mind. That appears to be where that capacity for empathy comes from. And it's knitted into those neural networks. This is my impression. This is how I imagine the prefrontal cortex. This bit at the front, which is the bit that makes us so human, it's not just talking. And just while I remember, I write these things up because I've got such a lousy memory. There is a book about it by a woman called Siobhan Boyce, which has only just come out. And anybody that is interested in this, or anybody that knows anyone that's got a baby, it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And Siobhan was a speech and language therapist who sort of left the profession in the late 90s because she said, everybody thinks it's just about speech and language. It's not. It's about a lot more than that. And most speech and language therapists would agree with her on that. So, as mum or dad or any other secondary attachment figure gradually introduces children to the world and mediates it for them, they start the first move into being Homo sapiens sapiens, which is language. And once we'd got language as a species, that meant we were motoring. One terrific neuroscientist I read, a guy called Merlin Donald in Canada. I hope to meet him next year. He said that until we had language, basically all our only capacity for memory was an understanding of the world was in our own head. We were trapped, as it were, in our own heads. We could probably make a few communications, probably by singing. They reckon that the Neanderthals probably sang. Male Neanderthals yodeled strategy across distance, and female Neanderthals crooned to their babies, and probably crooned to each other as they picked fleas out of their hair. So we've always had this musical thing that we've done, but it was once we got the idea that we could use symbols and put those symbols into the musicality, that was when language happened. That's the Vygotskian bit, that's the symbolic tool that we got. Turned us into this incredibly powerful species that could collaborate and had now got what Donald calls an external memory field. Right? We could share these ideas with other people and use language to remember things about what had happened in the past. Susan Greenfield, who again I get to talk to quite a lot these days, she's a neuroscientist interested in consciousness and memory. And she reckons that one of the most important things that happened then was as well as the song, we also started to get stories. And the capacity for narrative, beginning, middle, end, so that you can think forward and look back and make logical connections. That capacity for narrative, hugely, hugely important to our development as a species. So this is why, you see, I think that the Welsh had a better fix on all this than the English did, because you've got a tradition of Eisteddfod, which is story and song, recitation, story and song. Still a memory of the importance of that external memory field, which is purely oral language. And then, crikey, after several millennia, as long as children have been getting the developmental necessities, you can start making the leap to second-level symbolism, not only using those symbols orally, but actually finding ways with a second lot of symbols of putting them down on paper. Now that is going to move the species on infinitely further, because when it was just talking, all we could do was when we were in the same place. Once we'd moved it on to literacy, we can record ideas, we can record much longer ideas, we can keep it going over time and space. So the whole culture gets recorded and saved. The external memory field has grown unbelievably, and you get the Great Library at Alexandria, or the British Library. Amazing stuff. So what is it that children need? Well, basically, as I say, in order to get the language, they need the interaction, lots and lots and lots of it, preferably with one major carer, as well as other secondary carers, but one major person who becomes their sort of personal assistant through those first 18 months, 2 years. And then it opens out and they'll be interacting with other people, children as well. American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children under the age of 2 should have no screen time at all. Pass it on. The reason being that it's got to be in real time, real space, with real people for that thing to work. I'm fascinated watching my granddaughter. She's now 2. She has very little to do with screens because her mum is terrified of me. No, because her mum agrees with me actually, but no, she's had very little she's watched the odd bit of Bob the Builder, but not much. The only thing that there is that every Sunday, since she was tiny, the other granny and granddad come on Skype, yeah? And I think she's learned to deal with this, but I just wonder whether whether there's a big difference with that Skyping for that little one, because you can't watch their face. You tend to be watching yours in the corner. Do you know what I mean? It is real time, but they aren't really responding to you in their facial movements. Still, I don't think 5 minutes on Skype is going to make that much difference to her every week. But if children are watching, Colin Trevarthen did a really interesting experiment where he had mum and baby interact, and he televised both. And then he showed the baby, mum interacting with the baby, and the baby was watching and began to cry. Because what the baby needs is the immediate feedback. It's this constant loop that you've got to be on, where the baby's feeding the parent, rewarding the baby, rewarding the parent, rewarding it's got to be in real time. And they have found that in up to 16 months, watching TV actually, and DVDs, depresses language development, actually makes it worse. That isn't the main reason that the Academy has recommended that kids don't watch before that age. There's also the fact that for every hour of telly watched before the age of 3, according to another well-researched experiment, you've got a 9% increase in attention deficit at the age of 7. So that's probably linked. And according to Christakis, the guy who did that piece of work, he reckons that that's because the child that's watching an awful lot of telly, everything's moving faster. You're cutting from one thing to another. It's really exciting and interesting. And look away from it, and real life's boring. So they're seeking more stimulation all the time. There is only one piece of research so far linking it to autism, but because it's almost impossible to do the research. But they've got one piece that has made a link between early TV watching in those first few years and ASD. But that too is not the main reason that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children should not be having screen time before the age of 2. The main reason is that if they're staring at screens, they're not doing other things. And the other things they need to do, apart from interacting with mum and dad and everybody else, is move about and play. And by play, they do not mean picking up some highly coloured manufactured object. They mean just mess about with stuff that's around. I'm sorry, I've been going on. I'll make you do something now. Right, turn to somebody nearby, and I'm not talking about when you were tiny because you don't remember that. Just remember back as far as you can. And think about playing, and just for a minute, just talk about what playing was for you when you were a little kid. What was playing? What did you play? Could you just put a hands up if you found yourself talking about being outdoors? It's phenomenal. It's always the same. Right, second one, could you put your hand up if you found yourself talking about playing with other kids? So brothers, sisters, school friends, chums. It tends, again, to be the majority of remembered plays social. Yeah. Third one, okay. Who was playing out of the direct supervision of the grown-ups, either loosely supervised or possibly completely unsupervised, so that you were, tends to be the same. Right, and then the final one is who was playing with a specifically manufactured toy of some kind? Who actually did talk about a toy? Now, this must be Wales, you see. You must be particular, or maybe I fed you that one rather by mistake. But basically, I usually get the odd Barbie gets a mention, or the odd bit of Lego. Otherwise, mostly it's things like balls, skipping ropes, and so on. The bike. Bikes always get mentioned, and I've decided it's not a toy, it's a mode of transport. And it's used for getting away from the direct supervision of the grown-ups, yeah. The change in the nature of play over the last 20, 30 years has been staggering and extremely worrying. But that play, which is what you were designed to do, is how you developed all the capacities required for sitting down in a classroom and doing language and literacy. It's also how you honed your interest in finding out how things worked, dealing with triumph and disaster and treating both imposters just the same. Hands up the people who made petal perfume. You remember making petal perfume? Yes. You didn't do it just once, did you? You did it lots of times, didn't you? And it never worked, did it? Not until you put your mum's perfume in it. No. The point about play is you can just, try it and do it and try it different ways, and it doesn't matter. It's not the grown-up stuff. And this is why I'm so concerned about manufacturers and marketers and people invading childhood, because they have now convinced children that in order to play, they need certain things that they will sell them. They've also convinced girls that it's much more important to be dressed up like a princess than to be playing. And boys tend to think that it's more important to be staring at a screen and pressing buttons than the play that we're talking about. So right from the moment they're born, and particularly those first 7 years, the most important thing is that play. Outdoor, social, creative, active, loosely supervised, not too much supervision by the grown-ups, not too much direction, and not requiring any particular equipment. Where's the two books I was going to yell about? This book is splendid if you've not seen it. This came out around the same time as Toxic Childhood, and just like Toxic Childhood, it's just going to a new edition. So this is the new edition, it's come out this year. I'm working on a new edition of Toxic Childhood, which will be out in December, all being well, if anybody's interested, bringing it up to date. But this is Diane Rich and various other extremely well-reckoned early years people, first-hand experience, what matters to children. So I've mentioned the talking one. I'll just mention the other two. Juliet Robertson's Dirty Teaching. Fabulous. It's about getting outdoors as much as you possibly can throughout the primary years. And it would work, I would say, for foundation as well. That's the point she's making. But there's a lot more work gone on in the foundation phase on getting children outdoors. We've got to pull it through into the primary thing. So she's a very experienced teacher, absolutely brilliant. And she did a thing for a friend of mine who runs a marketing company for outdoor stuff. This is called Everyone Loves a Stick. And if you're looking for good ideas with sticks, there's a whole load of them along that. You see that thing that's like a bar? Right, yes, right. So if anybody that can grab one, you're welcome, right? There's one. You've actually got a note about the Not Just Talking book on there. And you've also got one about the other one that I'm telling people about like mad at the moment, Julia Sigmund's book called Supporting Boys Writing in the EYFS. So this is how do we support boys in writing in the pre-primary years. And I heard the title and I thought, I don't want them writing in the pre-primary years. I don't want to make a fuss about writing in the pre-primary years. This book is just the best practice. It's exactly like the sort of thing I saw in Finland. So anybody that's interested. And while I'm at it, I'll also mention this. I put a few of these on each table, so please, if you want one, take one. These are free from the National Union of Teachers. It is absolutely amazing that an education union is taking note of interest in education. I am stunned. But they've got a campaign now because the things what's going on in primary now is so worrying as a result of the germ influence that they've actually, young teachers have started it up. If there aren't enough of these to go around, I have more in the car, so anybody that can't find one that wants one, please grab me afterwards. It's got an article by me in it about modern childhood and another one by my colleague Richard House about our Too Much Too Soon campaign, which we are running through Save Childhood, and which anybody who's interested, it applies to Wales and Scotland and Ireland too, and it is called toomuchtoosoon.org. That's going to be on running until they do something about it. So what Ros and I were looking at was what do children need in order to move them, once they've got the language, to the capacity for literacy. And the first thing is play. Right through first-hand experiences, that's what matters, particularly play-based experiences. And then the second things they need are two things I've already mentioned. If you get these in the first 7 years, I think anybody that has not really got a serious predisposition to developmental disorder should be okay. Play, including outdoor play, story, and song. Those three are the key critical things, and those three are what I saw happening when I went to Finland. I couldn't get over the amount of music that was going on in Finnish kindergartens. From the moment they enter the door in the morning, music is threaded through the work that's going on all day. So they've got this sort of strange Finnish instrument that's a bit like a zither, and each child got its own little tune that it could make up itself when it started at the school. So they'd get their tune, they could maybe sing their name too, or just la la la, and that was what they used in the register in the morning. And the child could play their tune, or the teacher could play the variations on it, singing, lots of singing, songs for every single thing they might want to learn, songs to mark the punctuation marks of the day. So, you know, sort of come lunchtime, Agneta, the pedagogue, just starts singing the lunchtime song, and the children who are standing nearby join in with the lunchtime song, and then it spreads like a little ripple through the room, and gradually everybody is, as they sing, getting ready for lunchtime. Just all day long there was music, moving to music, singing. And I said to Agneta at the end of the first day, I love hearing children sing. It was just so uplifting all day that there was so much music. And she said, yes, this is possibly one of the most profound things anyone's ever said to me about education. She said, music trains the mind to pattern and the ear to sound. If you want literacy, folks, there's the way forward, because basically it's all these critical underpinning listening things, but particularly with the development of auditory attention span and auditory memory, and singing songs and joining in with other people. And it's also so socializing, isn't it? Because you're singing together and you're perhaps making the same movements together and perhaps moving around together. Boys particularly, that is, well, that's how they know how to socialize, boys. They've been doing it in the army for years. They get them marching and singing, you know, together. I mean, if you are, obvious, all formal learning is going to involve an element of repetition, isn't it? And the more singing is one of the best ways to do that repetition. But the development for kids today of auditory attention span and auditory memory is absolutely critical. And music is one of the best ways of doing it. Can I get back to that? No, I cannot, heck. So I don't know whether you can see there, but our strands that Ros and I decided for literacy were listening, talking, music, movement and memory, stories, and then the three things that related specifically to print, concepts of print, phonics, and the handwriting movements, moving into writing. So those were our seven strands. And the music to me is so central. I don't know whether you know, but at the point when humanity moved from the sort of language bit that we're talking about, that I said, you know, we leapt out of our own heads into the social realm so that we could share things through language. The point at which we made that big jump into literacy, Socrates railed against literacy. In the Phaedra, he says that literacy is a bad move. And his reasons were threefold. One, it's going to ruin our memory. If we can write things down, we won't need to remember them anymore. And of course, in ancient Greece, you memorized long speeches. And that business of memorizing, they felt, was part of the business of education. I do agree with them. I think to some extent there's stuff we need to have in our heads. You know, looking at human history, whenever people really wanted folk to understand, they'd make them memorize, you know, the creed, the Lord's Prayer. You've got those things in your head and you can come and bring it back, and each time you get a new insight on something, you know, you can relate it to that. Memorizing is important. And I think that that's one of the things I notice in all European primary systems, an enormous amount of oral work and quite a lot of repetition and memorization. And that's why I think that having a kindergarten stage to 7, which is entirely oral, is a very, very good idea, because it's increasing that capacity to remember and hold it in your head. Socrates' second reason against it was that if something's written down, I can't discuss it with the author. You know, when someone tells me something in real life, we can discuss it, we can, you know, have a dialogue, but I can't do that when it's written down. And his third one was, and when it's written down, it comes from somewhere. I don't know who that guy is. I can't look him in the eye and tell whether he's telling the truth or not. Actually, those same 3 arguments that Socrates was giving are accompanying us at the moment as we make the third great leap. There cannot be a more exciting time to be alive since the time of the printing press, because we're making this huge new leap beyond into an even wider external memory field, Google, and the whole of the web, and an entirely new way of, you know, using and recording our understanding and spreading it around. Massive leap, hugely exciting, love it to bits, but I think children need to go through the same phases that we've gone through because if we leap straight from there to there, there's things that we've learnt that Socrates had no idea about that we have benefited from in terms of literacy as we got better at it, that we would be very, 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 very sad to lose, especially if we don't develop our memory skills in language as well. So I would say, first of all, maximize the memory and the language with stories and song, and in terms of being able to sit down at your desk and keep your head still to read and move your arm to write, loads and loads and loads of active outdoor play. Going to knock off in 5 minutes. You're all wilting, but you can all get a break in 5 minutes. But can I just say the thing about the story? I mean, it is absolutely vital that kids get stories. And just like the changes in the nature of play, the lack of time people are spending singing and talking to babies nowadays because we've got so many distractions and we've got electronic babysitters. Just like these changes, the change in the business of giving children stories has been absolutely huge. Somebody sent me this and it summed it up perfectly. Again, the way we've passed on our culture to our young has always been sit round the fire at the end of the day. The old people will tell you the stories of the tribe. Yeah? In fact, here is a really interesting fact. Focus. This word kept cropping up. They can't focus their attention. You know, they find it difficult to control the focus of their attention. Right. I suddenly remembered that I once did a book for the primary market on word origins, and one of the words I'd done was focus. It was an alphabet, and I needed one for F. And I also needed one that came from the Latin. So I went, oh, focus, that's a nice one. And I looked it up, and it was really interesting. The meaning of, just focus in only came into use in the Renaissance. And it came into use because there was a need suddenly for it, because people were doing perspective in paintings, and they were grinding lenses for microscopes and telescopes and things. So this idea of focus, they needed a word. So they chose the Roman word for hearth or fireplace. Now think about it. When you went into a Roman home, what would draw your eye? It would be the fire, wouldn't it? You went into any sort of settlement, the thing that would draw your eye, that you would sit around and stare at, would be the fire. And while the old people were telling the stories, the kids could be looking at the fire and making the pictures in their heads, because the fire just keeps your eye busy while your brain works. What's the focus when you walk into a room today? Yeah. It's the thing that's moving there in the corner. But that's not giving you the headspace. That's taking over your headspace. Anyway, we still kept up that tradition of telling kids stories in the bedtime story, which back when I was tiny was everybody did it. Somebody would read you a story at bedtime or tell you a story at bedtime. I was lucky enough to be brought up by an illiterate granny, so she didn't read me stories, and she told me stories. Unfortunately, didn't know any of the old stories. She basically told me gossip about the local neighbours or my family, but they were good stories, and I used to get the same ones over and over again because I would ask for them. Tell me the one about Auntie Kitty again, Gran. Yeah. So, it was traditional for children to tell, for adults to tell children stories. Technology first arrived, and I do remember I did take advantage of it myself with my daughter as she grew older, and she was going to bed later. And quite frankly, I was absolutely exhausted by the time she got to bed, so we imported a tape recorder and Alan Bennett ready to sleep instead. But at least still, it was the stories. It was still the narrative, you know? They were still hearing voices. What happened by the late 90s? 80% of kids by 2000 had a television in their bedroom. No, it was by 2004. And they were watching stories. And what we lose there is the idea of narrative. It's a completely different experience. And Pi Corbett, my dear friend, and I, by this time, by the early 2000s, were both really worried by this development. And we both went off on different tangents, but Pi started this storytelling project, which has been going ever since and has grown and is amazing. Anybody been on Pi's storytelling? Yes, the odd one, yeah. Everywhere I go, he's been, you know, he's moved through. But I still remember those early days, because when he was first doing it, he was in Bristol, and he had to convince the schools to let him do it. And so he did a little project, which meant that he'd go into a school and say to the teacher, reception, can you give me an able child, a middle ability child, and a lower ability child? And he'd just stick a microphone under these poor kids' noses and say, can you tell me a story? And of course, by the end of his project, they could all tell stories. But at the beginning, he said, basically, the able child would usually come up with a reasonable version of Goldilocks or something, you know, good enough. The middle ability and the lower ability, he said, zilch. Some of them sang. Bob the Builder was the most frequently. But the other thing that they sometimes did was just give you odd words. Little girls going, Cinderella, sisters. You know, that was it. And the one that disturbed me the most was the little boy who said fish. He just stood there. He was a middle ability child, and he's just stood there going, fish, fish, fish. His teacher took him aside to find out what was going on. And it turned out he was attempting to tell the story of Finding Nemo. It was his favourite story. He watched it every night before he went to sleep. But of course, there's no voice there, is there, saying, once upon a time there was a little fish called Nemo who had a wonky fin. Early one morning, his daddy took him to school and he met the other little... So all he'd got was fish. And that was one of the, you know, the real impetuses for both Pi and me to think, we've got to do this talk for writing. We've got to do more and more and more oral stuff. And why, when I see what they do in European countries where they do not do any written work until the age of 7, and you get the extent to which children are able to do oral storytelling, and they, you know, they've done lots and lots and lots of oral work, then you think that's why they do so much better than we do. Quite apart from the fact that we're not forcing them to do something physical, particularly little boys, something physical with a pencil that they are quite frankly not up to. Last bit before you go. 2 years after Pi had been doing that little project, he phoned me up one day in a state of high excitement, and he said, Sue, I have just had a real insight. You know how I told you that the able child could tell you a story? And I said, yes. And he said, I got it the wrong way round. It's not that able children can tell you stories. It's that those children are able because someone has been telling them stories over and over and over again. And the light went on in my head as well. Utterly possessed by that ever since, and everything I have seen confirms that. And that's why 0 to 7, story, song and play, story, song and play are the things that actually matter. And I think those things continue to matter through primary school now, because so many of our children have missed out in the early stages. So, right, I've got that off my chest. You can all go and have a break. I just wanted to, it was one thing that I didn't manage to fit in, that I did want to mention, and that is, I think, if we can get our kids having the right things to make sure their language skills develop, and we therefore then get them started on literacy. And if we can make literacy, the learning of literacy, something that happens reasonably easily, not something that they have to struggle for. I mean, you know, some kids will struggle more than others, but the easier we can make it so that it happens and they're motivated to do it, and we can turn them into readers. And by that I do not mean a child who can tick the right boxes or, you know, say the right things on a test. I mean children who actually read. Then they've got another really amazing thing that will help them through life. I think that Socrates, when he objected not being able to open up a dialogue with someone who'd written a piece, I think it was because at the time actually decoding the, hope that's all right now, actually decoding the stuff off the page was a very laborious process. I mean, it wasn't really until we got properly printed material that most people could read with pretty rapid fluency. There's a story of, I think it was the Venerable Bede, who the other monks used to come and watch him when he was reading because he didn't even move his lips. You know, this guy could actually read straight off the page, and that was completely abnormal. So once we'd got the sort of text, the sort of printed text that meant you could, with a reading age of about 8 or 9, actually not notice the print. Do you know what I mean? You're looking right through it to the meaning. You're able, if you can go quick enough, you're able to be, and it's what's known as automaticity. If you're interested in the latest stuff on this, it's a pretty old book now. It was 2007, I think. But Marianne Wolf, who is the top woman in America, her book, Proust and the Squid, is absolutely riveting on this. She reckons that the thing we really need to inculcate in our children is automaticity. Because once you've got that, then you can enter into a dialogue, because you're able to take the meaning and, you know, interlock it with your own schema and think about it on top of the reading. So that is where we want them to be, so that they can do that. And so that they can also get Socrates' other problem about authorship. They'll also get the idea of what an acceptable accredited author is, as opposed to just some rubbish that they might be picking up off the internet. So to me, that whole process of the getting of literacy and getting to that stage of automaticity is incredibly important. And I think that is one of the most important things we do in the primary school. And the actual learning is increasing children's capacity to focus, self-regulate, and once they have automaticity, to empathize. Because when you read, you lock brains with that other person. You get inside somebody else's head. So this screen came about as a result of a conference I did in Japan. This is the one that gets me in trouble these days. It was on old and new literacies, and I'd been dragged over halfway across the world as a representative of a bygone age that actually thought books were important. And the person who was doing the presentation on digital literacy was an absolutely brilliant ICT specialist called Ian Jukes, with whom I had lots of discussions, and with whom in the end I totally agreed. And this is one of the things I found most annoying. The IT people, usually, we agree in the end. So why is it that I get in trouble saying this? Basically, what I was saying is that traditional learning requires actual focus, attention, deferred gratification. So these things can be learned through play and through interaction with loving adults, but you get the opportunity as a learner to do it for yourself when you're reading, and to really settle down to what is quite a dreary task, actually, all this cat sitting on mat stuff. You know, basically, you've got to put your head down and, you know, a couple of years' time, you might get a reward. The problem with digital learning is that while it's a brilliant shortcut. In my back pocket, I have got access to anything I want, and much of it in pictures. Yep, no problem. The list that's going to build up on the left there is mine. The list that builds up on the right is all Ian's words. So I wanted it not to be my words. It's not my interpretation. This is Ian's words. So, traditional learning increases your capacity to focus your concentration, whereas digital learning invites you to do parallel processing, to do multitasking, and to do continuous partial attention. Now, there's nothing wrong with those things, as long as you can do the other stuff as well. This is my real concern at the moment with these iPads for babies. Have you seen the activity seats? You strap your 2-month-old into the seat, you attach the iPad in front of the face, and the child can play on its baby apps. And they love it. The first iPad addiction centre for 3-year-olds opened last year. Because that's the thing that's worrying, that it becomes default activity, and it is addictive. And that's why the American Academy of Pediatrics is now saying no screen-based activity, not just no telly, no screen-based before the age of 2. I'm waiting for more information on this. Obviously, when Fisher-Price released that thing, they had no research to show that it was safe because this stuff's only been on the market for a very limited time. But I got a story from Dorset, it's my first one, story from Dorset about 3 months ago now, a very posh prep school that was having its open day for the 3-year-olds to come to pre-prep, you know. And this mum arrived with a little boy in tow, and mum was really delighted with her son. She said, the nursery teacher said, she turned up, she was really, really desperate to tell us how good he was and how forward he was, because he's brilliant on his iPad. And lo and behold, here's this little boy, he was brilliant on his iPad. But the nursery teacher said he found it difficult to stand without support. He could walk, but he preferred to crawl because it was easier for him. And she reckoned, she would say his language capacity was around about 18 months. And apparently mum, who'd been so full of how pleased she was with him, as she watched the other children in the setting that were there and suddenly realised this was mum presumably quite isolated, hadn't been mixing with other children, he'd just been with his iPad. She saw this and she apparently got really quite agitated, gathered the little boy up and left. That's the story, right? Now we have no idea whether that little boy had some underlying genetic predisposition to various problems. And I would suspect he probably did. But I also suspect the fact that he'd been on that flipping iPad had meant that he had not had sufficient of the genuine real-life movement, 3-dimensional, multi-sensory experience, which would have developed control and coordination, interaction with real people, which would have developed speech and other communicatory skills. Now that's pure anecdote, but I'm just waiting to see whether, as these flipping activity states and the iPotty and all the other stuff, which at the moment is being churned out by manufacturers who have no research evidence whatsoever to prove that this stuff is not damaging, whether we're going to see more problems. But I mean, who knows what it's going to do. Once you are able to interrogate text and you've become someone who can read with automaticity, then you are doing something in terms of neural activity, in terms of interconnections within the brain. It is incredibly complex, incredibly demanding, and incredibly good for your learning networks. The neuroscientists have long said that, you know, literacy changes the internal workings of the mind. It actually makes you cleverer. because what you've got to do, all these different things that you're doing at different levels, you know, with auditory, visual, information, as well as meaning, is massive in terms of interconnectivity. In terms of processing the other things, our puppy Meg can do that. In fact, our puppy Meg is just growing out of thinking that the moving images on the telly are worth paying any attention to. You know, she was dead interested to start with if a dog came on. She now knows it's not real. So, what literacy is developing is your capacity for sequential linear processing. Do you remember me going on about Susan Greenfield and the importance of narrative, which I then hammered home with Pye's great thought? The business of sequential linear processing is really important to the logical train of thought. The deep conscious processing is something that a reader is having to do all the time at the stage of automaticity. So you've got this capacity for rational, logical, sequential, linear thought. Now, what Ian was saying on the other side, yeah, it's terrific. It's fantastic. And the ability to make connections and do this superficial intuitive processing is hugely significant. Jonathan found me last night engaged in a game of cards. It went on till 1 o'clock in the morning. But what you're doing when you're playing cards, or indeed in real life, making constant connections and looking at patterns and not deeply consciously processing them. And we need to be able to do both in order to survive, to be able to do both. Literacy made us an awful lot better at that. And civilization, I think, has been the better for it. Neil Postman, I don't know if anybody wants to know where I'm coming from on both childhood and literacy, read Neil Postman's book, The Disappearance of Childhood. It was written in the 1980s, and I must have read it at a very formative stage in my life. But he said, yeah, print means a slowed down mind. The written and then the printed word brought a new kind of social organization to civilization. It brought logic, science, education, civilité. Electronics, on the other hand, speeds up the mind. Now, great to have the capacity to speed up and shortcut when you need to, but only if you have sufficient control over your focus of attention, sufficient self-regulation to be able to go back and forth at will. And there must be many of you here who already find it difficult. Who finds when they're sitting at a meal with a beloved friend or family and conversation's flagged and your phone goes beep? Who finds that they have to get the flaming phone out? Yep. It is terribly, terribly difficult to resist this stuff. If your brain's not got something going, we're so busy now. We want our brains to be busy all the time. And if there's nothing much going on, it's ever so tempting to get the wretched thing out. I am advised by people who know about this sort of thing that the latest trend is to have a technology basket in the house, and into the technology basket before any family meal and at bedtime goes every single handheld device that everybody has. Darn good idea, I say. Yeah, because we're going to have to learn to discipline ourselves. It's just too easy to be distracted by it. It's great, but it's taking it. Did anyone see that? It's probably still on YouTube. Did you see the Look Up video? Did you not get it? It had 37 million hits the last time I looked. It was a young man, and it's just a video, and it's called Look Up. And it must have been several months ago now, because it was when I was writing something. Absolutely brilliant. We're just going to have to be more disciplined, make use of it, rather than let it lead us by the nose. Right, brings me back to the horses. Right, also, brings me to waking you up. You're all going to be tired now. This is the worst time. So I'm going to make you sing, okay? As I said, one of the things that I think is really useful to do right through primary is keep a focus on this story and song. And you may remember that I said also that we're going to have to teach sort of grammar elements and spelling elements separately from the actual context in which you're getting children to write. So this is a song that my friend Michaela and I did for sentences, which I'm only going to do the first 2 verses, which are for reception or year 1. Yeah, but we've actually now got verses that go right through up to year 4, and I will happily send all the words, plus all the words of the other songs I've got at the moment, to Jonathan, if you would like to pass them round. Right, so let's get you going. Do you all know the tune of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean? Okay, this is Wales. I expect this to make the valleys ring. A 1, a 2. Oh, sentences break up your writing. They show where to stop for a rest. They help make your stories exciting. They help make your stories the best. Loudly! Sentence, sentence. Oh, sentences make text make sense. Make sense! Sentence. Sentence, oh, sentences make text make sense. You get the boys to do the make sense shout, and you get them to do it as loudly as possible. Right, 1 more verse just to keep you going. So tell me, how long is a sentence? And is it the same as a line? No, it can be longer or shorter. As long as it makes tense, it's fine. Sentence, sentence. So sentences make text make sense. Make sense! Sentence, sentence. Oh, sentences make text make sense. Woohoo! You should sing it a little bit faster, really, shouldn't you? Make it go from. That was written partly as a result of my first visit to Finland, because one of the things, as I said, was seeing song being used for everything. And there was a wonderful experience when I went into the first year of formal teaching, which would be our year 2. And the children, for the first time, were sitting and actually writing. Now, during that kindergarten stage, there would have been a lot of attention from mark making through to helping them form the letters and make patterns and so on, and do simple little bits of writing by the time they were 7, but nothing that wasn't appropriate to the child's developmental level. They very much basing it on developmental level. But they reckon that by the time they're 7, just about everybody's physically able to write. If they're not, there's a real problem. So we can expect them to sit down and do little tasks. And they were busy with syllabification. Finnish, like Welsh, is phonetically beautifully regular. So it's really nice and easy to do the phonics. But the grammar of Finnish is fiendish. And I say this as a grammarian. It's got great long case endings, and the words go on forever. And there's different something like 17 case endings for nouns. I mean, it's just awful. So these poor little kids have got to learn to syllabify these long, long words and work out the ending bits. And that's what they were doing at their desks. And they'd been at it for about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, when the teacher, who was a bloke, pressed a button on his CD player. Music started to come out, and every child immediately leapt up from their seat, and they're all going around the classroom doing this little dance and song thing with the teacher at the front, like the Pied Piper. And I'm sort of standing like this against the wall, thinking, what the hell's going on here? Eventually the music stopped. As soon as it stopped, they all just went back to their seats, picked up their pencils, and carried on. And I thought, that was lovely, wasn't it? So I said, what was that? They needed a bit of oxygen to the brain. And he said, yes, they'd been sitting a long time. I said, what was they were singing? And I frequently found in Finland that people would give me a look, what, you stupid woman, why are you asking this question? Because obviously what they were singing was that the song that they had done in kindergarten on that subject, the thing that they were writing about. So these songs would be taught and carried through the school, you know, and that was why Michaela Morgan and I wrote a sentence song that you could sort of build on. So they'd always know the tune. You could remember the stuff that they already knew easily in the first verse and then carry on into complex sentences and so on as time went on. Oh, incidentally, in England now, the term complex sentence has dropped out of the curriculum. We're not doing complex sentences anymore. We're talking about one clause or multi-clause sentences. So the difference between complex and compound isn't being discriminated. That's interesting. And it worried me to death till I got to talk to the linguists behind it, at which point I thought, actually, that's quite sensible, really, yeah, okay. But we are doing subordinate clause. So there's main clauses and subordinate clauses. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, the thing was, while Michaela and I were doing that with sentences and various other things, the Finns would never have needed to teach sentences, I realised. Second thing I saw in a Finnish kindergarten, because I arrived before the day started, was I turned up and some children, as always, had turned up early. And there was a little gaggle of boys. And they were sitting around a table. They would have been about 6 years old, sitting around a table, and they were holding pens, and they were engaged very quietly in writing. And I stood there going, boys writing at a table when they don't have to. And the kindergarten teacher, Agneta, looked at me and said, yes, they like to write. And I thought, and as time went on, I realised the reason they liked to write was that nobody made them. Which is the thing that's at the back of that Julie Sigmund thing. It's the, you know, make sure they've got stuff they want to write, make sure they are able to do it, competent to do it, get them talking about it, get them thinking, and then they'll want to. Anyway, that was the first thing I saw. The second thing that I remember was about half an hour into the morning. The little 3-year-olds had only recently arrived. This was about the second week of the new term. So we got 15 little 3-year-olds, have vertical grouping. So you've got 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, you know, and so 15 of each in one setting and various pedagogues. They just arrived, and I was noticing that they had already got the hang of going in and out because they had constant access to the outdoors. And they'd got a lovely wooded area outside, you know, and they could go out whenever they wanted, as long as they could get into their salopeds, because it's very cold in Finland. So they had to be able to get in and out of these little onesie things. But the teachers did not help them, right? The people who helped them were the older children. But they had a real motivation to get in and out of these salopeds so they could go running out into the playground. And most of them had got it by this time, but the ones who hadn't, it was lovely watching the older kids, you know, help them through. No supervision out there, incidentally, none. If anything happens, someone will tell us. Right, so that's going on all the time. They're in and out, and they're also playing within the setting itself as well. But the first little directed activity I saw Agneta do, the day had settled down, so we'd gone an hour into the day or so, and the first little directed activity I saw her doing with the wee ones was she started to tiptoe. This is going to be a real challenge, really work on this one. Right, she's tiptoeing round the room like this, and this is already giving a little sort of message, until she comes to a 3-year-old and she goes. And that little 3-year-old giggling, because they've got the hang of this has been done before, takes Agneta's hand, and Agneta continues to tiptoe, and that 3-year-old joins on. And we ended up with a chain of 4 3-year-olds, all tiptoeing and giggling with Agneta up to the front of the room. At the front of the room, she got 4 little chairs set out. No, they weren't little, they were normal sized. I said, why don't you have little chairs? We have little chairs. She said, well, they have to sit on these size chairs at home. Why do you have little? Anyway, so they got 4 chairs set out for them and 1 for her. And they sat down and she said, okay, our sentence today, she said this in Finnish, incidentally. know no more Finnish than I know Welsh, sadly. And I had a translator. Our sentence today is, my name is Agneta. And the little child said, my name is Sebastian or whatever, and it went round. It took 30 seconds. Yeah? At the end of the 30 seconds, she went, oh, wonderful, you say your sentences so well. Off you go back to play. Right, and I went over to her and I said, how lovely, a tiny little circle time, and they all spoke up so well. And she said, yes, we're 4 in circle today, we'll be 5 tomorrow. They were very good. And I discovered that they'd started at the beginning of the year with 2 in circle, right? Then it had gone up to 3 in circle if the kids were okay. If they weren't, they stayed 2 in circle, yeah? And gradually, what she's aiming at is every child stays at the amount they need for competence and confidence, gradually building up. And she reckoned by somewhere in the second term, 15 in circle would be perfectly easy for every one of those 3-year-olds. Not bad, eh? I also asked why they sat on chairs, because I said, we would usually sit on the floor in UK. And she looked at me in horror and said, but the vestibular system is not developed. And I thought, not only does she speak my ruddy language, she knows words I don't know. And I said, what's the vestibular system? And she said, it's the inner system of balance and coordination of your body and awareness of your body in space so that you can stand or sit unsupported. She said a little baby has no vestibular system, he flop. But as time, through, that's why they need to go out and run about a lot, because they need all this active movement and so on, gradually to develop this capacity. And she said, because we are focusing here on language, on listening, on starting to say sentences, I want to screen out all the other problems, so I give them back support. Gosh, that made a huge impression, because then shortly later, I'm back in an English primary school in a year 1, and they're doing a circle time with 33 kids, all sitting on the floor. The boys especially are not sitting. They are either lying, leaning on each other, leaning up against the wall. Poor vestibular. Well, they've not got that level of control. The whole thing was so well thought out. But, again, they're never going to have to learn what a sentence is. They've been saying sentences since they were 3 years old. And as time goes on, the complexity of those sentences are built up. The length, so you can do 1 clause, 2 clause, 3 clause, you can do subordinate clause, they would have grammar in their heads. And it goes around a circle, they're hearing the same patterned language all the time. It just made me think we could do so much more orally like that with kids, instead of constantly thinking we've got to write things down. Anyway, sorry, that was right. Quickly, to go through this, I'll take you through a couple of examples of what we did when we were, yeah, that will do. This was a teacher who was doing recount text, and so he decided that he'd use his RE where he was doing Hinduism, and he personally adored Gandhi. So first of all, he told the story of Gandhi lots of times, and then he got children doing acting out episodes from Gandhi's life, researching them more and finding out and acting them out. So there's plenty of opportunity. There's your active creative learning with opportunities for talk. He used drama. Then he introduced them to the idea of the recount skeleton. Are people familiar with these things? Basically, we had 6 skeleton types. This one only has the first 4. If it's a straightforward recount, just chronological text, it's a timeline, and you just jot your stuff along the timeline. The idea being that it can be in any form. It can be quick notes, it could be little pictures, it could be diagrams, it can be anything you flipping well like. One of the teachers I worked with called them memory joggers. Increasingly now people use photographs. So that it's just helping them remember something that's happened. And then you're going to have an introduction, which answers those questions, and so on. With this, once you've done it, and the best possible way for children to do it is in pairs, so that they're talking again and using the vocabulary again as they think it through. Once you've done that, you can think, well, I know what my first paragraph is, it's going to be that one. Where would be the best place to end the second paragraph? And draw a big line down. Third paragraph. So that you've got all your ideas sort of done and dusted before you. Instructions we did as like a flow chart. Yep. And recount, much more complicated. That was a spidergram, because you basically think, what categories am I going to think of this in? And then arrange it like that. So you're giving the children an opportunity to make a quick, but you don't want to spend forever on this, but a quick plot of how it's going to go. And then that actually gives the teacher the opportunity to look at that recount skeleton and say, hey, you missed this out. Or, are you sure that's the right order? Or, so that you're actually, the child is making its thinking visible so that you can talk about it. And for me, that's a miles better way than letting them get it all written down wrong. Yeah. So this chap's ones that they made a big class recount skeleton. And then finally, he took one of the paragraphs from it, and he did the thing that Debbie Billard called, when you write, you turn your memory joggers into sentences. Right? So you take the memory joggers and turn them into the sentences, the sorts of sentences that you would have been looking at in that bottom horse. Yeah, that you'd have been reading and saying. We found that sort of system, with giving a different diagram, a different skeleton, as we call them, to each of the types of text children might write, worked from reception. In fact, I've seen it used in nursery, where children are using either photos or their own pictures, and then just talking sentences right way through. There was one glorious week when I saw it being used in a nursery and in Oxford University for the discussion text. So, I mean, it's a very, very basic principle that can be applied as appropriate to whichever age. Here's your report. With reports, there's a lot more, actually, needs to be taught about how to do that business of categorization. Yeah? But once you've got your spidergram, then your intro and your ending are going to be the same. And now there's absolutely no need to draw lines down, because basically your blobs are your paragraphs. So one of the lovely things about doing this is it does actually do paragraphing for you. This was a lovely project. She was turning her classroom into a museum of Greece, ancient Greece. And each pair of children had responsibility for researching one of those areas and then teaching the rest of the class. So they were going to research it, they were going to make visual aids, posters, they were going to make up the little speeches that they could give to the rest of the class, and then they were going to teach everybody else about it. She modelled the process all the way through by doing buildings with a partner, and she made the Parthenon out of toilet rolls and things like that. And then, that was in the days when you could make things from toilet rolls for health and safety. And then the children did the same. There's a boy and a girl, actually, working together on that one. We're doing clothing. Those were their skeleton notes. Was it really interesting, that one? There was a bit of gender going on as well. That's their final one, and you can't see the joins, but they'd actually edited it quite a lot as they went along, because the girl did the writing down and the boy told her what to write. Yeah? And at one point he said, why don't we, hang on, it'd be better if we did it like this and had a different blob. And she said, if you want to do it differently, you write it. And he said, hang on a minute. And he went off and he got a pair of scissors and he cut out the wrong bit and they stuck it back down again. And he said, there, it's all right now, you can carry on. And fool that she was, she did. And they also got quite into this cutting it. And as I realized, it really is this thing, it's a work in progress, isn't it? And you can actually do real life cutting and pasting. And I actually think it's quite handy to do real life cutting and pasting sometimes so that they don't think that it all happens by flipping magic. It is actually giving you that opportunity to a bit of concrete learning about the way things are. Anyway, they'd made a chiton and various other things, and they did their talks. And the teacher showed with her skeleton notes how to turn her memory joggers into sentences and create a double-page spread for a class book about ancient Greece. They ended up with the whole school being brought round to hear the talks and see the museum and everything. It was a lovely, lovely piece of work. So that you can imagine loads and loads and loads of opportunities for talk. And also talk for writing, because giving a prepared talk, of course, is one of the best ways of making sure you've got your sentences. I have to put that up. I found that when I was going on in Southend-on-Sea. Isn't that lovely? Concretisation of learning with hoops. And this was Debbie Billard, the lady that had come up with that line about turning your memory joggers into sentences. She'd taken her kids to the seaside. This has had to be redrawn because their paintings wouldn't come out. But she said, I very often don't get them to write it up. I use the skeleton method just as a way of recording now, because you don't always want them to write it up, and they like doing the drawing. So sometimes it's just a nice way of recording what's happened. They've been to the seaside. Year 2, term 3. It was the year every year 2, term 3 went to the seaside. And she said, if I had got them to write it up, though, I can give them another instruction. I can say, turn your memory joggers into sentences, leave a line between buckets. Yeah? And we've got paragraphs. So basically, that's just an illustration of how the skeletons work. And they are still available and have been available in the past in Welsh. Can you get them in Welsh still? Jonathan's working on it. I'll have another go if you like. I did try to rally the troops. We had a lovely lady called Delith that translated them. But they don't need retranslating. All they need is just they can just use Delith's translation. But they're now available in various ways. And I discovered when I went to the car to look for stuff, I found these. I really don't know. Can I give them to Jonathan? They're stand-up skeleton books that can go on desks. I don't know what you'll do with them, but I got them as author copies. Wales can make use of them. I'm very grateful. Right, so back to that. I hope I've conveyed this. Right, reading. I am so keen on children reading aloud. I really think that from the point of view of getting them to internalize those patterns of written language, they have to read aloud. So please, as much as possible throughout the primary school, look for ways of getting them reading aloud. I think there's two major ways that I would really commend. One is paired reading, when children share a book or a piece of text that you have given them and they just read it to each other, a paragraph each or a page each. Or if they are young learners or special needs learners, a sentence each, because it's a really good way of raising their awareness of sentence boundaries. So paired reading, they can share a book together as, as a pair of friends. Or if you've got something in your cross-curricular work that you want them to know and you want them to read about it, photocopy it off. I would rather it weren't on the screen for this, because I think they need to share the text on their knee, so it's best printed off, and get them to read it to each other a paragraph at a time, and when they've finished reading it, go back to the beginning and read it again. You cannot read things often enough, children. It's good for you, and I will be asking you questions on it at the end, right? That's one thing. Second thing, I am possessed by these days, choral reading. I think it is one of the best uses of an interactive whiteboard. If you can put up a piece of text and get them reading it together, I like varying the voices, so the first sentence will have this group over here, second sentence that group over here, and so on, so that you're getting a variety of voices. Sometimes you could have all the girls reading for a paragraph and then all the boys reading for a paragraph or something. This is brilliant for those kids who don't like reading aloud because they're not very good at it. They can just open their mouths like goldfish, but they are hearing it and they are seeing the text. And I really, really commend as much as you can possibly do of this. And one of the reasons is it's what I see them doing in Europe. They do an enormous amount of reading aloud together. And I think it's good for them. So lots of opportunities to hear. Pi's line on how do we learn is listen, imitate. Yeah, there's nothing better, is there, than this? And then innovate, and then you can invent your own. And then opportunities to do talking the language of writing. Pi did loads of stuff on storytelling. I've done things called speaking frames. There's plenty of stuff out there now, but I did want to finish by, have I got 5 minutes to do Monty? This was a teacher who'd done what I thought was a truly lovely project. She'd got the kids to make a Victorian doll's house. She was going to do a Victorian project. So for her active writing, she'd collected loads of cardboard boxes and made a doll's house with the boxes set up against the back of the room. And then she'd given children in groups of about 3 or 4 a room to furnish. And this was way before the project started. There were loads of books in the classroom, loads of opportunities for ways for them to find out what the schoolroom would be like, and so on. Would work so well with Downton Abbey on at the moment, this. But, and they had to furnish the schoolroom and the servants' quarters and so on. And of course, because it was groups working, it got quite competitive, and people's granddads were sort of whittling Wedgwood, furniture and things, and they're making amazing things out of matchboxes. Anyway, so eventually, not only did we get the doll's house, but of course, as the children were talking about it, we got the family that lived there too. This sort of family grew, and the servants. And the potential, when she started her Victorian project, the potential for drama, role play, hot seating, but also for small pieces of writing were enormous. You know, you could have diary entries, you could have a little bit of newspaper report about something that happened around the house, you could have letters, postcards, all sorts. So it was just a beautiful piece of work for lots and lots of talk and writing. So I'd asked her, would she do something that Pi and I, well, putting together a lot of the things that we'd seen that we liked. And one of the things I'd seen was in Reading, where the children were only writing on one side of the paper. They were writing on their right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, that was a work in progress page. That was the page where they could jot down anything like, teaching targets for today or whatever. We asked them to do something that Pi calls a shopping list, which is not criterion referencing or anything. That is just, the teacher has taught, well, they'd done similes. And she just wanted them in the piece of writing they were going to do today to see if they could remember to use at least one simile. On the principle, again, as Pi said, you need repetition. You need to keep coming back and getting them to remember it so that it's not, I've just taught it and now it's gone. But also, we asked for a couple of grammatical things on this one. One was a sentence starting with a where chunk, with a phrase at the beginning. Over the mountains, meanwhile back at camp. That it's a fairly technical adverbial thing. And then the third one was a drop-in clause for detail, where you're dropping in a relative clause like, the knight who was wearing shining armor killed the dragon. Yeah? So can you get us one of those in too? And again, none of this was criterion reference. This was simply, we've done these, we've just quickly revised that principle, see if we can get one in. And if you didn't, it doesn't matter. Second, this was a character study. The children were asked to do a character study. So here we are, I'll take you through very quickly how it worked. Monty's boss, Mrs. Treadgood, the cook, Mrs. Tredgood was an enormous woman, 20 stone at least, and she liked to throw her weight around. When she was angry, she was like the mighty ocean, no stopping her. The ocean just rolls on and on, big, huge waves of angriness. Her eyes bulge out like... She's surprised at how bad you are. She folds her arms, which are big like tree trunks, and stands on legs like two strong tree trunks. She's the scariest thing on earth. Up in the dining room, I heard her voice booming. She was shouting at the kitchen maid because she put a cooking pot in the wrong place. Poor old Maria, thought Monty, who was really relieved it was Maria getting the row, not him. He got on with his work quickly. No way did he want to get in Mrs. Treadgold's bad books. Right, the idea was a piece of writing which shouldn't take much more than 20 minutes, yeah? And work in progress page. So anything like spellings. If he'd been wanting to do a little skeleton, that would be the place, or any sort of planning activity. And when the teacher, oh yes, and of course when he's done it, he also checks to see whether he's got his shopping list before he hands it in. And the teacher can use the page for her feedback. So I have to say, this one went to town because she was doing it for me. I think she did get a little bit carried away. There's rather a lot. Great, I can really see Mrs. Scary, Mrs. T. Love the way you switch scenes, points of view. I quite understand why you thought you were Monty. That's him, he's got carried away and he's gone into the first person when he was supposed to be writing in the third. She's also asking for some corrections. So there's a school policy on how you show you want full stops in and things like that. So, and she also wants some spelling correction. She's an old-fashioned teacher like me, and she wants some spellings. And, oh, we asked him to do a pie thing. Pie has this thing, when you hand work back, choose one little bit to ask them to polish. Right? Just make it that little bit better. So she's chosen a line down the bottom there. He got on with his work quickly, which is not particularly inspired, and has asked to have it polished. And here we have the child doing the corrections. First, he's doing his spellings. I think it is good for them to write spellings 3 times personally. Second, he's putting those right in the text, and he's also sticking his full stops in, putting anything else right. Third, he's polishing. He quickly carried on polishing the knives and forks, click, clatter, till they are spick and span. And finally, this is an interactive page, so he sends a note back that says, hope you like the polish about polishing. Now, when I saw them doing this in Reading, I thought, isn't that brilliant? Because one of the things teachers say to me with grammar particularly is, well, we have to do exercises in the books as a record of teaching. You know, it's the way that people know, and we're going to be assessed by Ofsted. And I just thought that's a miles better record of teaching and learning, you know, from Ofsted's point of view. You couldn't do it all the time, but you could do it at certain times when you... But anyway, so if you want that, Jonathan, I've just found that whole thing with all the interactive on the... and you're very welcome to pass it about if you want to show other people. I didn't know I'd got it. It's only because I was looking for the other one. So anyway, thank you very much indeed. I have now finished. I am slightly over. You'll have to be very quick with your evaluation forms. Thank you very much indeed.